With me today is Dr. Ben Wilson, who is Associate Professor of Black Studies at Western Michigan University. Welcome, Ben.
How are you doing?
Just fine.
Good.
First of all, who were the first blacks in Kalamazoo, and when did they come?
Okay, we're talking about their arrival as settlers around 1830. A Quaker minister by the name of Henry Way was an instrumental person in it. But not everybody, all the blacks who settled in southwestern Michigan were runaway slaves. We're talking about maybe less than 5% between the years 1830 and 1865. The largest concentration were primarily freed blacks. These are individuals who, through hook or crook, became freed, whether through self-purchase, last willed and testaments of their masters, acts of manumission from southern state legislatures, if that were the case, and those individuals who purchased themselves. But self-purchase was quite rare in the Americas. It was more pronounced and more common in Catholic Hispanic America. But that's primarily how they got here.
Okay. What was the population, would you say, before the Civil War? Before
the Civil War in Kalamazoo, let's say 1860, we're talking about close to 300 to about 500. The largest concentration of black folk in southwestern Michigan during the pre-Civil War years was in Cass County. We're talking about close to 1,400. The largest was in the Detroit area. And the reason why it was in the Detroit area is because Windsor is just a spit over the river. The reason why Cass County had a large black population was because of its Quaker presence, the availability of land, and in certain portions of that county, the amicable environment, but not the whole county.
And then other blacks from the South would hear about these communities and have relatives possibly, and then come to join the community.
As a matter of fact, after the Civil War was over, a lot of men who were from southwestern Michigan, which would include Kalamazoo all the way to Berrien County, around the campfires would tell stories about this area. And some of their comrades in war, after the Civil War was over, decided to come here. That's how Sojourner Truth became so important in Calhoun County after the Civil War. Now, between the time periods 1914 to 1918, we're talking about another migration of black people from the south to the north, and some of them eventually ended in southwestern Michigan areas.
That's actually called the Great Migration.
Yes, the Great Migration. Between 1914 and 1918, we're talking about anywhere from 1 to 2.5 million black Americans leaving the south going north. As an example, in 1895, we're talking about roughly 98% of blacks in America were Southern. But between 1914 and 1918, you have this call of this migration north. And strangely enough, some of the same terms used by runaway slaves to refer to the north were used by those folks who migrated between 1914 and 1918. For example, the Promised Land, Beulah Land, Canaan Land, etc. Uncles or sisters might migrate to a place in Detroit and send a letter back home telling their cousin down in Bessemer, Alabama, that they ought to move to Detroit because the temperature is ideal. It's 60 degrees all year round. Of course, we know that's a tale.
Was that typical that they would find, they'd get up here and find that there were other tales that were told? It wasn't the Promised Land.
No, it wasn't. In some cases, it became the urban asphalt jungle. You know, we're talking about a person who was like 4 times removed from West Africa's shores to the plantations of Alabama to the urban jungle of Chicago. So a lot of the tales, the folks realized it with that. But the thing is, money was to be made up here. Not only did the American South lose its laborers, but it also lost a large percentage of its black professionals who decided to pack up and move. Another reason why you find folk up here, in addition to jobs, but I guess it's hooked up to jobs, sometimes labor recruiters will go into American Southern communities and with tickets in hand to recruit people. A good example would be the steel factories, or the sheet metal factories in Muskegon. Usually when people did migrate during the period 1914, 1918, they migrated in a linear pattern, somewhat of a straight line fashion. And if my destination, if I were living, say, in Savannah, Georgia, and my destination was the black Mecca of America, Harlem, my money might run out before I get to Harlem, and so I'd stop in Newark or Philly or D.C. Interestingly enough, I think Nathan Huggins wrote an interesting book, a study entitled The Chicken Bone Special, that dealt with the migration of these Po people from south north. I made sure I said Po because sometimes people don't know the difference between being Po and poor.
What is the difference?
Well, Po or poor is when your mother and father can barely supply food, clothing, and shelter. Po is when your mother and father can supply two. That's food and shelter. Your clothing comes from your older brother or older sister. That means when it's time for you to buy a pair of shoes for your little kid, you buy a size 12, but his foot is only a 7, and you put cotton and socks in the toe of his shoe and say he will grow into them. Po is when you have to have black and white saddleocklets. You know, the kind you can walk up to that concrete wall and kick it, and the paint won't come off the shoes. You can take the same shoes and lay them in the middle of I-94. Semis can run over them, they still polish. That's Po. But Huggins, in his book, The Chicken Bone Special, talked about this migration from south north. And usually if you were Po, you couldn't afford to eat in the dining car. And in some cases, you couldn't eat in a dining car because of Jim Crow restrictions. And since chicken was the cheapest of all meats, Mama would fry up some chicken, and then you would eat your chicken while other people were in the dining cart. And once I finished eating my chicken, I would kick the chicken bones under your seat. Not under mine, but under yours. And once the train reached its final destination, the janitor would come out and clean the cart that we were on, and he'd find nothing but chicken bones.
Big carcasses.
Big carcasses. It's called a chicken bone special.
But there were blacks here when the migration came. How did the two groups get together? I mean, how...
Yeah, the classic case of old-timer versus newcomer.
Right,
The old-timers, whose forebears had been living in southwestern Michigan since the 1830s, would attempt to socialize the newcomers. If you are from the urban north and you are black, folks would automatically assume that northernness make you a little sharper than those who are basically southern.
A little more sophisticated.
Yes, so that means when you go back to visit your relatives in Tampa, Florida, if you have a 1953 Chevrolet in 1988, you buy a brand new car to impress upon them that you are wealthy because you live in the north. All of your kids get at least 3 new clothing uniforms to impress upon your southern country bumpkins who are hayseeds that you are wealthy. I might be a recipient of AFDC in Chicago, but to them, they think I'm wealthy.
How else did the socialization happen? What other things did they do?
Well, if I just arrived from, say, Oklahoma, Mississippi, and I move into a community and the people have been living here since the 1830s, they would attempt to de-southernize me. They would say things like, don't wear red clothing out.
Why is that?
Don't laugh too loud out in the streets. And if you have a watermelon, eat it in the backyard. Because there were a lot of stereotypes and myths that people had about all African Americans. And the old-timers wanted to prepare me for those myths. Because if I decided to live up to one of the stereotypes, the people in a larger community would say, see, I told you so, they were that way.
Were the jobs here when they got here?
In Kalamazoo or in urban America?
Both.
Well, in urban America, you could always find work in Detroit if you were hooked up with Henry Ford. Henry Ford would contact some of his cronies who were like black ministers, and these black ministers would recommend people from the congregation to work for Ford. But I hope I didn't leave the impression Henry Ford was a righteous individual. Henry Ford was a right-wing industrial genius, but he was right-wing in his social and political thought. In Kalamazoo, the jobs that were available, say between 1914 and 1918, were as domestics and chauffeurs. You could be a domestic at a person's house or a chauffeur, but that individual might own a department store. You couldn't work there, but as a domestic and a chauffeur, right on, okay? The reason why this migration occurred between 1914 and 1918 instead of between 1865 and 1870 was because of big business. So jobs was one of the principal reasons. 1914 and 1918, the First World War. And the Axis of the Germans had this new weapon of destruction called the submarine. And unrestricted submarine warfare, as expressed in the sinking of the Lusitania, had an impact on the non-Anglo-Saxon Europeans who were coming to America, who were the laborers. But once the Germans started using this policy, that flow of folks from Europe to America slowed down. Furthermore, a lot of people who were coming from Central and Southern Europe decided that they would stay home and fight for the motherland. But Henry Ford still needed someone to tote those barges.
That's right.
And that's when the labor recruiters went south to get the people.
And that's why that migration happened during those 4 years.
During those 4 years. And as a matter of fact, another one occurred during the Second World War years.
For the same reasons?
For the same reasons. Counties would have X number of men that have to be in the armed forces. But you still got to crank out that steel.
And that's when women came into the workforce.
That's when women came into the workforce. That's when the fellows in Muskegon went to the American South to recruit people from Camden and Magnolia, Arkansas. Ironically, today, the migration has shifted. You know, folks talk about fleeing the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt.
Yeah. Right.
Black folk are doing the same thing. Not primarily solely because of economic reasons, but a lot of us begin to realize that the American South is more progressive in its political, social, and economic life than urban northern areas.
Now that's been a switch over the last 20 years.
A complete switch.
Yes.
I guess one of the reasons for it, in my opinion, is that the American South in the early 60s, it was under the microscope. Constantly under the microscope, constantly under scrutiny. Now the American South is the ideal place. Atlanta, Georgia, Andy Young is the mayor. But you remember Atlanta, Georgia, once upon a time they had Bull Connor. Folks fled him. Birmingham, Alabama, Arrington is mayor now. New Orleans, Dutch Morial is mayor. I hope he's still there. But these are the reasons why people are migrating back. Not only because they're trying to escape the Rust Belt and the beautiful weather we have in the Midwest, but also because of the social political climate.
Has changed.
It's changed completely. Like, I am from the American South. I am from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I think the Midwest, specifically this area here, is the most conservative place I've ever been in my life. And I spent 4 years in Kansas with Dorothy of the Wizard of Oz. And when I retire, I'm going back home.
Back to Florida.
Back to Florida.
When we talked about the Great Migration of 1914, 1918, and you talked about the socialization of the blacks coming in with the new group, and that they couldn't work directly in the factories. That also seems like it came within their society too, and so some of their, for instance, they couldn't be insured by the big companies. They couldn't maybe go to morticians, white morticians. How did all this work within their own society and get built up?
It's a good question. In some factories, let's start with that one. In factories, the least desired, the dirtiest, and the hottest jobs were relegated to those individuals who migrated from South North. Now, as a result of people thinking the North was a land of milk and honey, and they found that Jim Crow was here too. You see the development of black entrepreneurs because certain businesses did not want to cater to these individuals because they were threatened by them. So you see the development of black morticians, black beauty parlors, black barbers. And for those individuals, Jim Crowism was profitable. In some cases, those individuals were reluctant to see things integrated too. They were reluctant because they had a black market captured. Now all of a sudden, Avon now discovers the dark and lovely look. But once upon a time...
and the money that they have. Right.
Money talks, BS walks. Okay. And when people realize there's a dollar to be turned, sometimes they make these Hollywood chameleon performances, that change the character. But this Jim Crowism did prove to be an economic plus for some individuals who had the entrepreneurial genius.
Now, are they going to be, out of business with Avon and the barge
No.
companies coming in?
No. I recently read an article, I think in either Black Enterprise magazine, where Avon was telling the people who made fashion and cosmetics for black women that within 10 years we're going to absorb you. And I said, the arrogance of Avon. No, they won't absorb anybody. I guess sometimes if you're wealthy as heck, you can be extremely arrogant.
Yes.
And Avon represents that. No, they will never do that. Never. It's about time they realize that black Americans are consumers. I hate to say it, but we're large consumers. I think, let me give you an example. In 1985, black Americans spent close to $1 billion on cosmetic goods. I know I spent a lot of money on cologne. You're not going to ever get me to buy no Dick Butkus Aqua Velva. I would go down and buy some Obsession, which is $38 compared to the other.
$5 or whatever.
Right. The 4th of July, imagine how much money black Americans will spend on barbecue sauce, okay, on gum, on whiskey. What happens is we are an economic entity. In 85, black Americans spent more money supporting the American capitalist scheme than England, France, Japan, and Ireland combined. Okay.
Yeah. What has been the role of the black church in black society?
Oh, during the migration era, 1914 and 1918, the church was one of the socializing institutions. They would take Ben, who just migrated from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and attempt to Kalamazoo-ize him. They would say things like, Wilson, you can't eat watermelon on the front porch. And I'm going to say, who said so? Okay. Wilson, you can't laugh that loud.
Yeah.
And those red pants, take them off. Well, so the church has been responsible for socializing during that time period of migration. In addition, the church also supplied, the church was the center for a lot of self-help organizations to develop. I'm talking like black self-help organizations like burial societies, which eventually became insurance companies because, as you mentioned, insurance companies were reluctant to insure black folk because we were perceived to be a risk. We're talking about the Metropolitans and the Prudentials. Okay, that led the way to the formation of black insurance companies like those that are in North Carolina and Atlanta. The church also played a vital role in helping young men realize what it is to be a man. I'm talking about like the rites of passage from boyhood to manhood. Sometimes in our society, I wish we could initiate young boys into manhood again, because today a lot of young boys just sliding into manhood once they turn 18, but they still have the mentality of a 14-year-old. And there are some guys who are 60 who perpetrate being men. So we're talking about the church socializing, the church providing extremely important functions other than the spiritual thing. When there was a need for a meeting to occur and there was no facility like the Douglas Community Center, the church was always available. The ministers of the church were very actively involved in the civil rights struggle. If you think about the civil rights struggle of the 60s, or better yet, even the abolitionist societies, the anti-slavery people of the 1850s, you can't help but see Reverend
Jesse Jackson.
Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
That's right.
Reverend Martin Luther King, Minister Malcolm X. You know, church is very much important there.
Yeah, and the whole leadership of the community.
The whole leadership,
Right.
in some cases.
Sorry, Dr. Wilson, we're out of time.
No
we could go
problem.
on forever. Maybe in 20 years we'll have you back and talk about where the migration's taken us at this point.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate being with you.
Thank you.